Hey NBA2K fans, in this video we're going to talk about the trade exception. We're going to talk about what it is and how it works. That way when you're playing your My League and My GM files, you'll know what it's all about and how you might be able to utilize it. So if you're new to the channel, I am Coach 2K. If you love basketball and you love NBA 2K, you're going to want to subscribe to my channel and also click the bell to get notified whenever I upload anything new, so you don't miss a single NBA 2K video that I put out. Also, while you're here, be sure and check out my fictional My League series featuring superstar Byron Dantley. I'll put a link in the upper left-hand corner of this video to the playlist so you can start that series from the very beginning. I think I got about 36 episodes in there right now as I record this. And so with that out of the way, let's talk about today's topic, which is the trade exception. Okay, in terms of the trade exception, I'm going to tell you where to find it, what causes it, and then I'm going to go through some examples because it's much easier to understand with some examples, I think, than just to tell you what it is. But a trade exception is created when one team trades away more salary than they get in return. And you can find the trade exception in the salary cap table when it's created, and it's in yellow here. So here I'm looking at the Detroit Pistons salary cap table. You can see they got 3 items here, and if you look at the key to the right here, it says trade exception in yellow. That's what these are. So when you look at the salary cap table, if you see that, that means there's a trade exception. Now, if you're not familiar with how the salary cap table works in general, I did a video called Salary Cap 101. I'll put a link to that in the upper left-hand corner, so be sure and check that out as well. So now that we know kind of what it is, let's do an example here to kind of show you how it's created. All right, let's say that I've decided that I want to trade Bogdanovich. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at his contract situation. And I can see here that he has an expiring contract at the end of this year, and he's due to receive $10.5 million. After I look at his contract, the next thing I got to do is look around the league for a player that I might want to trade him for. After I identify the player I want to trade for, I have to make sure that it's a valid trade in the trading system in NBA 2K. In order to be a valid trade, the salaries of the 2 players' contracts have to be within a certain range. Now, it doesn't tell us in 2K what that range has to be, but let me give you a couple of examples here. If we look at Bogdanovich's contract again, you can see his contract is worth $10.5 million. So in a perfect world, I'd find a trade for a player with that exact same contract where the player's salaries match exactly, and I know that'll be a valid trade. For example, here, if I wanted to trade Bogdanovich for Terrence Ross, you can see he has the same contract, and so if I wanted to trade Bogdanovich for Ross with the Magic and the Pacers, you can see that it is indeed a valid trade. However, if I wanted to trade Bogdanovich for Klay Thompson, you can see Klay Thompson's contract is $18.99 million, $8 or $9 million or so above Bogdanovich's contract, and you can see here it's not a valid trade. So in the case of Klay Thompson, this just is a straight up deal. I'm not going to be able to make that trade because the salaries are too far apart. Now it goes the other way too. So if I'm trading for a player that makes less salary, like if I wanted to trade Bogdanovich to the Bucks for Malcolm Brogdon, you can see he's due to make $1.54 million to $10.5 million to Bogdanovich. So you can see in the trade system here, that's not a valid trade and I can't make it. So the point of all this is that the contracts have to match to some degree, and the way you find that out is just throwing it in the trade system to see if it's a valid trade or not. Also, you don't have to trade for players on the same number of years left on their contract. Here, John Collins, for example, with the Hawks, if I wanted to trade Bogdanovich to the Hawks for Collins, you can see that it's 2.3, 2.69, 4.14. The total of his contract is close enough to the $10.5 million that is left on Bogdanovich, his contract, that it makes it a valid trade, because the total value of the contract, regardless of the number of years, is within the range that the trading system will approve and say that it's a valid trade. You can see here that if I wanted to trade Bogdanovich for Embiid, Embiid has this huge contract, which is so far away from the single year $10.5 million value contract that Bogdanovich has, that it just doesn't, it's not a trade that's going to match up close enough under the rules. The best advice I can give you is, if you have your eye on a player you want to trade for, is just to throw the people in the system and see if the system considers it a valid trade or not. Because I don't know what the range is exactly to tell you one way or the other. After a while, you'll be able to eyeball it. You'll know, you can't trade Bogdanovich for Embiid. You can just tell by just kind of looking at the contracts. But if you're not sure, just throw it in there and have a look. The other thing that's going to matter too is what your cap position is. So if you're under the cap before you make a trade, and you're under the cap after you make a trade, you're not going to create any kind of trade exception, because trade exceptions are only created for teams that are over the cap. So just keep that in mind. Your cap space has a role to play here, whether a trade exception is created. So if you're under the cap, you're not going to get a trade exception. You have to be over the cap in order for that to trigger. After you've found a valid trade, if that team accepts that trade, it's going to depend on the other contract that you trade for, whether a trade exception is created. In the case of our example potential trade with Terrence Ross on the Magic, trading Bogdanovich for Ross, since their salaries are about the same in this upcoming season, if we made this particular trade, even though we're over the cap, there wouldn't be any trade exception created. However, if we traded for a player like John Collins, Bogdanovich's $10.5 million salary this upcoming season is a lot different than this $2.3 million salary that John Collins has. And that imbalance in that particular year, if we make this trade, is going to create a trade exception. And you can see I have this trade set up here. So once we offer this trade to the Hawks and they accept it, then what's going to happen is there's going to be, because the difference in that first year is so large, there's going to be a trade exception created. So let's propose this trade and see if the Hawks will take it, and they've agreed to our trade offer. So now Bogdanovich is on the Hawks and Collins is on the Pacers. And now if we look at our salary cap table for the Pacers, you can see at the very bottom here it says Bogdanovich, and there's an $8.3 million amount in yellow, which means it's a trade exception. And you'll see it's listed twice, both in 18 and 19, and 19 and 20. That's because the exception is good for 12 months, and it's going to go into next year, but it's only one trade exception. And this trade exception was created because we gave away more salary than we took back. And this trade exception we can use to sign another player even though we're over the cap. And that's why they call it an exception, because it's an exception to the cap. It allows us to use that money to go over to the cap, but only in a trade situation. Now let's say that after we made that transaction, we've decided that it's in our team's best interest to trade Sabonis to another team. So we put him in the trade system here, and now we have to find another player that we want and see if it's a valid trade. So let's say we decided that we wanted to trade for, on the Wizards, that we wanted to trade for Trevor Ariza. And you can see here that this trade doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because Sabonis' contract is like $2.66 million and $3.53 million, which is, around $6 million, where Trevor Ariza is around $15 million. So there's like $9 million difference there. And because that range is too big, the system won't consider it a valid trade to get it to go through. Now, normally we wouldn't be able to make this trade without adding another player. However, we have this trade exception, which allows us to sign a player that we wouldn't normally be able to sign because we can use this exception to make up the salary difference. So if we go in here to exception, you can see the trade exception for $8.3 million for Bogdanovich. You can also see when it expires here. That way you know how long you have to use it. And if we want to put that in the system, you can see now that trade exception allows us to trade Sabonis for Trevor Ariza as a valid trade. And if we wanted to ask the Wizards if they wanted to accept that trade, then it can go through. And even though we were over the cap, that trade exception allowed us to continue to stay over the cap, and it also allowed us to match up the salaries so it would make it a valid trade. And then if you look at our salary cap table, you'll notice that we no longer have the trade exception that was created when we traded Bogdanovich away for Collins. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is that there's two sides to this trade, because remember, we traded with the Wizards for Ariza, and remember, they traded more salary away than they got in return. And if you look at their salary cap table, then you're going to see a trade exception over there. And here it is. When we look at the Wizards salary cap table, you can see the trade exception for Trevor Ariza for $12.44 million. And so then they could use that trade exception if they wanted to do something similar to what we did when we traded Sabonis to the Wizards. Trade exceptions expire a year after they're created. So if you don't use the trade exception in a trade, then what's going to happen is it's just going to fall off the books and you won't be able to take advantage of it. One thing you got to be careful of is in the off season, you have to decide whether you want to keep your trade exception or you want to renounce the rights to it. And I did a whole video on cap holds and renounce rights, and I'll put a link to that in the corner. So if you want to review how those rules work. But if you renounce the rights to your trade exception, then it won't count against your cap anymore. So if you needed that cap space to sign a player, of course you'd renounce it. But if you wanted to hang on to it, then you'd leave it in your system so that you could use it a little bit later on. Now, while we use the trade exception to trade Sabonis for Ariza, that was just an example. I mean, that might not have been the trade that would have been best for the franchise, but it would have been enabled us to trade for a much higher quality player than Sabonis's contract would have allowed us to do. And so these trade exceptions may come in handy if you needed them. And if you see them on other teams in their salary cap table, you can use that as potential ways to put together trades that you hadn't thought of that might not quite work just based on the contracts alone. All right, so that's what the trade exception is. That's how it works in NBA 2K. I hope that helps you out. If you got any questions, be sure and put them down in the comments. And check out my other Fictional My League series while you're here. And in the meantime, I am Coach 2K. I'll see you on the court in the next video.